On July 7, 1683, two things happened 40 miles apart. At a place called Petronell in the flat, marshy country east of Vienna, a Habsburg field army under Charles of Lorraine was forced back by the vanguard of an army that no European power had recently managed to stop. Charles pulled his surviving troops north of the Danube. The southern road to Vienna was now open. That same evening, a long stream of carriages rolled out of Vienna's gates at speed. Inside one of them sat Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor, King of Hungary, King of Bohemia, and as of that day, a man fleeing his own capital. Behind him, roughly 60,000 citizens were doing the same, packing the roads west toward Passau. By the time the last carriages cleared the gates, Vienna's outer suburbs were on fire. The defenders were burning their own homes, orchards, and churches to deny cover to the army that was coming. A wasteland of smoke and ash spread for miles around the walls. Inside those walls, roughly 16,000 men would stay. They knew one very simple number: 60. 60 days, that was roughly how long the summer campaigning season would give an attacker to break a fortified city like Vienna before autumn logistics collapsed. 60 days to hold or Vienna would fall. And if Vienna fell, the road into the heart of Christian Europe was open. This is the story of what happened over those 60 days. It is a story about a grand vizier who believed he had one summer to write his name into history. About a city commander left with a garrison outnumbered roughly 10 to 1. About a Polish king riding hard from Krakow with a force he had promised to bring and no guarantee he would arrive before the walls came down. And about a piece of terrain west of Vienna that everyone on every side believed no army could cross. 60 days. One siege. And a question historians are still arguing over 3.5 centuries later: how did the fate of Central Europe end up hanging on a battle that, by every rational measure of 1683, should never have taken place? To understand how Vienna ended up in this position, you have to step back nearly 2 centuries. By 1683, the Ottoman Empire had been the dominant military power on Europe's southeastern edge for almost 200 years. Constantinople had fallen to them in 1453. Most of the Balkans had fallen. Most of Hungary had fallen. By the late 16th century, the Ottoman frontier ran through central Hungary, less than 100 miles from Vienna itself. For generations, the Habsburgs, who ruled Austria from Vienna, had lived with this border the way modern countries live with an unstable neighbor, with fortresses, subsidies, careful diplomacy, and the constant background knowledge that a very large army could, in principle, come north. Then, in the mid-17th century, the pressure eased. A dynasty of skilled ministers, the Köprülü family, took de facto control of Ottoman policy, rebuilt Ottoman finances, and stabilized the border on terms the Habsburgs could live with. A peace was signed at Vasvar in 1664. 20 years of relative calm followed. Vienna grew. Its walls, first designed for 16th century warfare, were not fundamentally modernized. The city's population settled at around 60,000. Its bureaucracy expanded. Its trade drew in Balkan and Armenian merchants carrying new goods, including, eventually, coffee. Vienna in 1683 was a European capital, not a frontier fort, which is exactly what made the next choice possible. In 1676, a new Grand Vizier took office in Constantinople. The Grand Vizier was the Sultan's chief minister, effectively the head of the Ottoman government, the man who ran wars, diplomacy, and taxation, while the Sultan remained the sacred head of state. His name was Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha. He was, on paper, everything the empire needed. He was the foster brother of the reigning Sultan, Mehmed IV. He had risen through the Köprülü faction. He was ambitious, capable, and this was the part that would matter later, intensely conscious of standing in a shadow. The shadow belonged to Köprülü Fazıl Ahmed Pasha, his predecessor. Fazıl Ahmed had been one of the great Ottoman statesmen of the century. He had won wars, he had annexed territory, he had done what a Grand Vizier was supposed to do. Kara Mustafa, 6 years into the job, had done nothing on the same scale. He needed a campaign. He needed a victory. He needed something big enough to fix his name in Ottoman history alongside or above the men who had built the office. He looked north, and he saw an opportunity. By 1682, Habsburg Austria was distracted. In the west, its old rival France, under Louis XIV, was pressing the Rhine border and quietly encouraging any policy that weakened the Habsburgs. In northern Hungary, a Protestant Hungarian noble named Imre Tokoli was leading a rebellion against Habsburg Catholic rule and had just accepted Ottoman protection. And inside the Ottoman military establishment, there was an appetite for a major campaign, a chance for the Janissaries, the empire's elite standing infantry corps, to see loot and promotion for the first time in a generation. Kara Mustafa put it all together into a plan. He believed the Habsburgs were isolated. He believed the European powers were too divided by religion and rivalry to build a joint relief force in time. And he believed the Ottoman army, if it could reach Vienna's walls with its full siege train intact, could do what no Ottoman army before it had managed: take the city itself. On the last day of March 1683, the Ottoman court gave him the target. Sultan Mehmed handed him the sacred standard of the Prophet, a green banner said to have belonged to Muhammad himself, carried by Ottoman armies only in campaigns understood as decisive. The next day, April 1st, the army marched out of Adrianople, the empire's second capital, and turned west. Officially, the objective was the Habsburg fortress of Győr, halfway between the Ottoman frontier and Vienna. Realistically, everyone in the vizier's tent understood where the road actually led. The march was slow, because Ottoman armies always were. They moved as mobile cities. By some estimates, more than 100,000 fighting men were on the road, along with tens of thousands of camp followers, merchants, laborers, camel drivers, and pack animals. Bazaars, kitchens, silk pavilions, workshops for shoeing horses and repairing weapons, an entire logistical world moved forward at the pace of an ox cart, and somewhere in its baggage train, it carried the largest concentration of siege guns and expert sappers the Ottomans had assembled in decades. Sappers were military engineers who dug tunnels under enemy walls and blew them apart with gunpowder. Meanwhile, in Warsaw, a signature had just changed the situation. On the same day, the Ottoman court handed Kara Mustafa the standard. King Jan III Sobieski of Poland-Lithuania and Emperor Leopold I signed a mutual defense treaty. It was a strange document for its time. Poland and Austria were both Catholic powers, so a religious framing was easy. But the operational core of the treaty was harder. If Vienna were besieged, Poland would march. If Krakow were besieged, Austria would march. It bound the two crowns into a joint military obligation of a kind Europe rarely produced. The treaty was signed in March. In April, the Ottoman army moved. And nobody in Warsaw or Vienna yet knew whether the promise on parchment would translate into cavalry on the ground fast enough to matter. By early July, the situation had crystallized. Kara Mustafa's army had crossed most of Ottoman Hungary. The Habsburg field army, commanded by Charles of Lorraine, was retreating carefully in front of it, trying not to be destroyed before Vienna could be secured. Charles was a French-born Habsburg loyalist, whose home duchy had been swallowed by Louis XIV. He now fought, in effect, for a country in exile. On July 7th, that careful retreat broke. At Petronell, the Ottoman vanguard, Crimean Tatar cavalry riding for the Sultan alongside Tokoli's Hungarian rebels, caught the imperial army in the open. It was not a decisive battle in the technical sense. Charles of Lorraine was too skilled to let his entire force be destroyed. But it was decisive in effect. At Petronell, Charles was forced to make a choice: hold his ground east of the Danube and risk being surrounded, or pull his entire army north of the river and surrender the southern approach to Vienna. He pulled north. That single tactical decision determined everything that followed. When Charles crossed the Danube on the afternoon of July 7th, the road from Petronell to Vienna became an open highway for the Ottomans. There was no field army left between Kara Mustafa and the walls of the imperial capital. Nothing but rumors, refugees, and burning suburbs. Which is why, that same evening, Emperor Leopold I got into a carriage and left. 60,000 civilians left with him. The imperial court, the treasury, and most of the ministries all rolled west toward Passau. Vienna was not entirely undefended. It had on paper Around 11,000 professional soldiers, plus perhaps 5,000 armed citizens, under a man Leopold had appointed to the post only days earlier. His name was Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg. He was an Austrian officer of considerable experience, and more importantly, of a temperament that would matter even more than experience. Starhemberg was 55 years old. He was tough. He was profoundly stubborn. And he had just been handed a task that by the numbers looked impossible: hold a Renaissance-era fortress against an army that outnumbered his garrison roughly 10 to 1 for however long it took a rescue army to arrive from beyond the horizon. If one ever did. For a week, Vienna waited. The Ottoman column crawled forward. Refugees kept streaming out. The defenders finished burning their own suburbs. Thousands of homes, churches, and orchards deliberately reduced to ash so that Kara Mustafa's engineers would find no cover timber or shelter within musket range of the walls. Then, on July 14, 1683, the Ottoman vanguard came into view of Vienna. Kara Mustafa established his headquarters and pitched his own tent in sight of the city he intended to break. It was a massive silk pavilion the size of a small palace, with an inner court, apartments, a treasury, and a court of officials. That morning, a rider from the Ottoman camp carried a formal document to the Viennese wall, a summons to surrender. The wording was standard for an Ottoman capitulation demand. It was also brutal. Accept Islam and the Sultan's authority, and Vienna would live in peace. Refuse, and in the phrase used in every Ottoman ultimatum, the men would be put to the sword, while the women and children would be enslaved. Starhemberg's exact reply, if he ever gave one in writing, is not preserved. What is preserved is what he did. He refused. At that moment, on the morning of July 14, 1683, on the eastern wall of a city whose emperor had already fled the siege of Vienna, began. 60 days, in principle, was what Kara Mustafa had. 60 days, in principle, was what Starhemberg had to survive. And somewhere within that count, 400 miles to the northwest, a Polish king was about to make a decision that would set the two clocks against each other. The Ottoman plan for Vienna was not, strictly speaking, to storm it. Storming a Renaissance-era fortress meant losses that even the Ottoman army could not easily replace. Vienna was protected by the standard fortification system of its century, a star fortress. That meant 12 enormous stone bastions shaped like the points of a star, so defenders on one wall could sweep the ground in front of the next with musket and cannon fire. In front of the walls sat dry moats. Beyond them were ravelins, separate triangular outworks placed like advance guards to break up a direct approach. Beyond those lay a long, gentle earthen slope called the glacis. It forced any attacker to climb uphill under fire before even reaching the moat. There was no dead ground, nothing to hide behind. A frontal assault against Vienna's walls, carried out properly, would kill tens of thousands of janissaries. So, Kara Mustafa chose the other option. He would take Vienna the way the Ottomans had taken most fortresses from underneath. His plan was mining. His sappers, military engineers trained to dig tunnels under enemy walls and blow them apart with gunpowder, would extend long, zigzagging trenches forward from the Ottoman camp. From there, they would drive tunnels beneath the moat and under the bastions themselves. At the end of each tunnel, they would pack a chamber with black powder. When it detonated, the bastion above would collapse into a crater. The janissaries would then storm the crater and fight their way inside. It was slow. It was expensive. But for the attackers, it was survivable. On July 19th, 5 days after the siege formally began, the first great Ottoman mine exploded beneath the counterscarp, the outer wall of the moat, opposite the Berg Bastion on the western side of the city. The ground shifted, with a sound witnesses described as an earthquake. A crater opened where part of the wall had stood. Janissaries surged into the smoke. Viennese defenders fought them back with pike and musket in near total darkness. That day marked the true opening of the siege. Not the arrival on the 14th, not the ultimatum. The 19th, when the tunnels began collapsing walls. From then on, the fight for Vienna became above all else a fight underground. The city's defenders, under a German military engineer named Count Georg Rimpler, began digging tunnels of their own. Starhemberg trusted Rimpler more than anyone else on the technical side of the defense. These new tunnels were countermines driven outward from beneath the bastions toward the Ottoman approaches. When a countermining team broke into an Ottoman tunnel, both sides fought hand-to-hand in the dark, sometimes by sight, sometimes by touch, sometimes with pistols fired in passages barely 3 feet wide. The winner blew the loser's tunnel closed with a small charge and moved on. Above ground, artillery duels continued day and night. Below ground, an entire second siege was being fought that nobody on the surface could see. The problem was arithmetic. The Ottomans could commit hundreds of sappers at a time. Vienna could commit dozens. The Ottomans could extend their trenches for miles. By the end of the siege, they had dug something like 25 miles of them. The defenders could only push theirs as far as the outer edge of the glacis. Every week, the Ottoman tunnels crept a few yards closer. Every week, another bastion took more damage, and every week, more Viennese defenders died. Some died in the tunnels. Some died on the walls. Most died from a disease the garrison called the red flux, and modern medicine calls dysentery. The city's water, drawn from a moat now clogged with corpses and refuse, was killing people faster than the artillery. By the end of July, roughly a quarter of the garrison was dead or too sick to fight. Meanwhile, 180 miles to the north, another number was moving. North of the Danube, Charles of Lorraine, the field commander forced back at Petronell, had rallied the surviving imperial troops into a mobile force of roughly 20,000 men. He could not break the siege by himself. He was outnumbered 5-1. But he could pressure the Ottoman lines of communication, and he could hold ground while reinforcements gathered. The reinforcements he was waiting for were German, Bavarian, Franconian, and Saxon troops from princes who owed the emperor military service and were slowly, expensively being persuaded to provide it. And then further north still there was the Pole. King Jan III Sobieski was, in 1683, the most militarily distinguished monarch in Europe. He was 54 years old. He was heavy red-faced, and this mattered the elected king of a country whose kingship was not hereditary. Poland-Lithuania was unique in Europe, a monarchy that chose its rulers through a vote of the noble class. Sobieski had won the throne in 1674 on the strength of his military reputation, built while commanding Polish cavalry against Ottoman armies in the previous decade. He was popular, he was Catholic, and in his own mind he was in a race against time. He wanted to turn his elected crown into a hereditary one. He wanted to secure his son's inheritance. He wanted to leave a dynasty behind. The march on Vienna, if he made it, would either complete that project or bury it. If he arrived in time and won, he would become the man who had saved Christendom. He would gain international fame, papal support, and political capital he could spend on his son's future claims. If he arrived late, or if he lost, he would lose his army, and with it, his political base at home. His court was full of Polish nobles who did not want him to march at all. Poland had its own southern frontier to defend. His wife, Queen Marie Casimir, whom he called Matyszenka in his private letters, was one of the few people he trusted to speak plainly. She told him to go. He decided to march. On August 12, 1683, Sobieski left Krakow with the vanguard of what would eventually become roughly 27,000 Polish troops. At the core of that force was his heavy cavalry, including one formation that would matter more than any other, though not yet. From that day, the two clocks in the story were running against each other. Kara Mustafa was digging. Sobieski was riding. Which one was faster? For most of August, the answer looked like Kara Mustafa. On August 15th, the Ottomans captured the outer ravelin of the Burt Bastion. This was the part of the fortification system that stood in front of the main wall, like a stone breakwater before a harbor. Once it fell, the Ottomans could move their sappers directly against the inner curtain wall, the actual skin of the city, with only the moat between them. Every yard of tunnel they now dug was a yard closer to Vienna's interior. Rimpler and his engineers extended countermines desperately, but the arithmetic was moving against them. Inside the walls, the situation was worse than Kara Mustafa knew. He believed, from prisoners taken during raid, that Vienna was close to surrender. He was not entirely wrong. Bread was running out. Dysentery was killing dozens each day. Artillery ammunition was carefully rationed. Starhemberg still refused to negotiate, but his own men were writing home about improvised palisades built from house timbers and doors ripped from shop fronts. Kara Mustafa, however, was making a choice. It is a choice historians have argued about ever since. He could have shifted toward a massive frontal assault on the weakened bastion. His army was still strong enough. The defenders were exhausted. A storm would have been costly, but it might have worked. Instead, he stayed with mining. He wanted the city intact when it fell. He wanted the palace's treasuries and merchant houses to pass into Ottoman hands undamaged, so he could present the Sultan with a prize worthy of the sacred standard. He believed he had time. And he believed the relief force was too distant, too divided, and too slow to matter. Which brings us to a story most modern audiences learn about the Siege of Vienna. It is worth pausing over because the familiar version is dramatically incomplete. The story usually goes like this. The siege was a great religious clash. Catholic Christendom on one side, Islamic Ottoman power on the other. Cross against crescent in the last great struggle between the two faiths for control of Central Europe. Except the reality on the ground in 1683 was far messier than that. Consider who was fighting for the Ottomans that summer. Alongside the Ottoman Janissaries and Muslim Crimean Tatar cavalry rode 15,000 Hungarian Protestants, followers of Imre Tokoli, Christian men who preferred a distant Muslim sultan to a Catholic Habsburg emperor pressing them from Vienna. And consider who was supporting whom. Louis XIV of France, the most powerful Catholic monarch in Europe, was quietly encouraging the Ottoman advance from Versailles. A Habsburg distracted in the east was a Habsburg who could not stop French expansion on the Rhine. The siege was a religious event. It was also, at the same time, a European civil war with an Ottoman spearhead. Protestant Hungarians fought Catholic Austrians. Catholic France supported Muslim Ottomans against Catholic Habsburgs. The banners were religious. The politics were not. None of that mattered inside the walls of Vienna on the morning of September 3, 1683. That morning, in one of the counter-mine tunnels beneath the Berg bastion, Count Georg Rimpler was mortally wounded. He had been directing the counter-mining work personally in near total darkness when Ottoman fire brought debris down around him. He was carried back into the city and died within hours. In operational terms, his death was a disaster. Rimpler had been the mind behind Vienna's underground defense. He was the man reading vibrations in the ground, guessing where the next Ottoman tunnel would emerge, and timing the countercharges. There was nobody in the garrison who could truly replace him. The countermining slowed almost immediately. The next day, September 4th, the Ottomans took advantage. A massive gunpowder charge exploded beneath the Berg curtain wall. When the smoke cleared, there was a gap 30 feet wide in the main defensive wall of Vienna. Inside the breach, Starhemberg's men were already stacking timber. By this point, the Viennese response to a hole in the city's outer defenses had become brutal and improvised. They pulled doors from houses, tore beams from shop fronts, dragged shattered timbers into the gap and piled them into a wooden palisade, a wall of scrap behind which musketeers could still fire. A breach in the stone wall did not by itself take the city, but it was the beginning of the end. Once the Janissaries could pour through a gap in the stone and face only a wooden barrier, the balance would shift quickly. On September 4th, Kara Mustafa was, by every reasonable projection, only days away from taking Vienna. But the other clock had also been moving. Charles of Lorraine had been marching. The German contingents had been arriving one by one at the meeting point. He had chosen Tulln, a river town on the northern bank of the Danube, 40 miles upstream from Vienna. There were Bavarian troops under the Elector Max Emanuel, Saxon troops under Elector John George III, Franconian troops under a coalition of smaller princes. And in early September, Sobieski himself rode in with the vanguard of his Polish cavalry. He had completed the forced march from Krakow faster than anyone expected. He reached the rendezvous with days to spare. On September 7, 1683, 3 days after the Berg curtain wall was breached, the full Holy League Relief Army had concentrated at Tulln. The count was somewhere between 74 and 80,000 men. 27,000 Poles under Sobieski, 18,000 Bavarians and Franconians, 11,000 Saxons. 18,000 Imperial Austrians under Charles of Lorraine. It was one of the largest coalition armies assembled on European soil in the 17th century, and it had come together in roughly 9 weeks, from the moment the treaty obligations took effect to the arrival of the final regiments at Toulon. Kara Mustafa had believed in April that Europe could not do this in 90 days. He had been wrong by a margin that would ultimately kill him. But there was still a problem, a serious one. Between the Holy League camp at Toulon and the Ottoman camp outside Vienna stood a piece of terrain called the Wiener Wald, the Vienna Woods. It was not a decorative forest. It was a steep, dense ridge of hills and ravine, thick with old-growth trees, and cut only by narrow tracks. Ottoman scouts had inspected it. Ottoman strategists had dismissed it. To move a relief army across the Wienerwald with heavy artillery was, in the professional judgment of nearly every experienced European field officer of the period, effectively impossible. It would take at least 2 weeks, and the movement would alert the Ottoman camp long before the relief force emerged from the trees. Which is exactly why Sobieski and Charles of Lorraine decided to do it anyway. They left most of their heavy guns behind. They stripped the army down. They moved through narrow forest paths at night, in silence, in small columns. And they crossed the Wienerwald in a single punishing forced march. Tens of thousands of infantry and cavalry threaded through mountain trails in darkness, carrying only field pieces small enough to be broken down and hauled by mule. On the night of September 11th, 1683, the final regiments reached the summit ridge of a hill called the Kahlenberg. Inside Vienna, Starhemberg's men were still fighting to hold the shattered inner palisade at the Berg curtain wall for one more day. From the top of the Kahlenberg in daylight, you could look east and down into the Ottoman camp. You could see mile after mile of silk pavilions, artillery parks, animal enclosures, and the enormous central tent of Kara Mustafa himself. You could see the trenches winding toward Vienna's bastions, and through the summer haze you could see the city walls beyond them. Still holding, the relief force made camp on the ridge in darkness. They lit no fires, they made no noise. Below them, the Ottoman army had been encamped for 2 months. It trusted its schedule. It believed no relief force could come through these hills. By now, it was exhausted by mining warfare and disease. It heard nothing. In the pre-dawn hours of September 12, 1683, a Capuchin friar named Father Marco Daviano began saying Mass on a stone altar set up on the summit of the Kahlenberg. He was a papal envoy sent by Pope Innocent XI to hold the coalition together through its endless disputes over command. He said the Mass in Latin, in the cold, in the dark. Sobieski himself served as one of the acolytes. When the Mass ended, the sky above the Kahlenberg was beginning to turn gray. Below, in Kara Mustafa's camp, the sappers were still asleep. The janissaries were still asleep. The horses were still tethered. Above them, on the ridge, 74,000 men were forming for battle. At 4 in the morning on September 12, 1683, the first rank of Imperial infantry stepped out of the trees at the foot of the Kahlenberg and opened fire. The battle that followed lasted 13 hours. And for most of those 13 hours, it was not obvious to anyone inside Vienna, inside Kara Mustafa's tent, or on the Kahlenberg Ridge, who was going to win. The Ottoman army woke to the sound of muskets on its western flank. It had been caught in a position it had never planned for. Its trenches, siege guns, and mining operations were all oriented east toward Vienna's walls. 60 days of engineering had focused every major asset in the camp against the city. Now from the west, a coalition army was emerging from terrain Kara Mustafa's own strategists had judged impassable. He had to make a choice, and he had to make it fast. He could commit his full strength, including the janissaries dug in against Vienna's bastions to face west, meet the relief army, and try to break it in the field. But that meant abandoning the siege at the moment Vienna's walls were physically hours from collapse. 60 days of digging, thousands of dead sappers, the near breach at the Berg curtain wall. All of it would be thrown away for a field battle he might still lose. Or he could split his army, keep a hardcore facing east, still pressing Vienna while turning everything else west to meet the coalition. This was the option that allowed him to imagine for a few more hours that he could still take the city. He chose the split. Historians have argued about that decision ever since. Based on the numbers available to him that morning, it was probably the wrong one. Because the moment he divided his force, both halves became insufficient. The force facing west was too small to stop the coalition, especially on ground where Ottoman cavalry could not fully deploy. The force facing east remained trapped in the siege trenches, exposed to Vienna's guns and unable to reinforce the rest of the army. As the morning wore on, the Ottoman line facing west began to bend. For 9 hours, Imperial infantry under Charles of Lorraine, together with Bavarian Saxon and Franconian regiments on the coalition center and left, pushed downhill through the vineyards and orchard terraces below the Kahlenberg. It was brutal, close-quarter work. Ottoman troops fought hard. Ottoman artillery, whenever it could be turned, struck the descending columns. Casualties on both sides climbed into the thousands. But the geometry was fixed. The coalition was coming down. The Ottomans were being pushed back toward their own camp, and with every mile the coalition advanced, the Ottoman position narrowed, trapped between Vienna's walls behind them and a hostile army in front. Sobieski had been holding his cavalry back. His Polish force on the right wing of the coalition line had spent most of the day moving down through the woods alongside the infantry. Much of the cavalry advanced dismounted, allowing the horses to conserve their strength for what came next. Sobieski was waiting for two things. He was waiting for the Ottoman line facing west to begin to fray, and he was waiting for the ground ahead to open into terrain wide enough for a mass charge. By late afternoon, he had both. At 5 in the afternoon, on a wide, gentle slope east of the Kahlenberg, Sobieski gave the order. 18,000 horsemen emerged from the tree line at a walk, then a trot, then a canter, and over the final 400 yards, a full charge. At the point of the formation rode roughly 3,000 men who represented in 1683 the last unbroken tradition of shock cavalry in Europe. They were the Polish Winged Hussars. The name was not decorative. Each hussar carried a tall wooden frame mounted either to the back of his cuirass or behind his saddle. Rows of eagle or ostrich feathers rose several feet above him. At full gallop, in mass formation under the low sun of a September afternoon, thousands of feathers cut through the air above the sound of armored horses striking the ground. By accounts attributed to Ottoman survivors, the effect was terrifying. It was meant to be. But the wings were not the weapon. The weapon was the lance. Each Polish hussar carried a hollow lance nearly 18 feet long, longer than the pikes most infantry units could set against him. That meant the hussar could strike his first target before the target could reach him. The lance was designed for a single impact. It shattered when it struck. After that first blow, the hussar drew a saber, or one of the pistols carried on his saddle, and kept moving. Sobieski had trained his hussars for one purpose: hit a line at full speed and go through it. That is what they did to the western flank of Kara Mustafa's army on the afternoon of September 12, 1683. The charge down the slope east of the Kahlenberg was by the weight of horse alone, the largest concentrated cavalry charge in European military history. Roughly 18,000 riders, 3,000 elite hussars at the front, tens of thousands of hooves striking the ground together. They hit an Ottoman line that had been fighting for 9 hours. A line already retreating, a line with no time to form proper defenses, and a line facing the wrong direction, with the siege of Vienna at its back. The Ottoman formation did not break in stages, it broke in a single blow. Within 90 minutes of the impact, the Ottoman army in front of Vienna was in full flight. Not withdrawing, not falling back, running. Thousands of men fled east and south, anywhere away from the Polish cavalry. The vast, mobile city that had housed more than 100,000 people for 2 months was abandoned in place. Tents were left standing. Kitchens were left burning. Pay chests remained where they sat. The sacred standard of the Prophet, the green banner Sultan Mehmed had personally handed Kara Mustafa in Adrianople 5 months earlier, was cut down from its pole and carried away in the final minutes before Polish troops overran the vizier's tent. Kara Mustafa himself escaped, riding hard toward the Hungarian border. By nightfall on September 12th, the Ottoman army had ceased to exist as a fighting force in front of Vienna. Its camp artillery, stockpiles, treasury, and wagons were all in coalition hands. Inside the walls, Vienna's defenders heard the Ottoman camp being overrun. They had fought for 60 days on shrinking rations. They had lost close to 3/4 of their original garrison to combat and disease. For 10 days, they had held a wooden palisade behind a 30-foot breach in the outer wall. Now they heard the sound of Kara Mustafa's camp being sacked, and they understood what it meant. The next morning, September 13th, Jan III Sobieski rode into Vienna. He passed through the shattered outer defenses, past the burned remains of the suburbs the defenders had destroyed in July, through the streets of a city that had been eating rats and burying its dead in the moats. Later that day, from Kara Mustafa's captured tent, the silk pavilion where the Grand Vizier had spent 60 days directing the siege, Sobieski wrote a letter to his wife. "God and our Lord has given our nation a victory, and fame such as past ages have never heard of," he wrote to Marashenka. "Their entire camp with all their artillery and infinite treasures has fallen into our hands." In a public statement in Latin, he adapted a famous phrase associated with Julius Caesar: "Veni, vidi, vici." I came, I saw, I conquered. Sobieski changed it. Venimus, vidimus, Deus vicit. We came, we saw, God conquered. The captured booty was staggering. Later estimates valued the gold, silver weapons, silk tents, provisions, and pack animals at roughly 3 times the annual state budget of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Kara Mustafa's silk pavilion alone became a touring exhibit. For weeks, coalition soldiers searched the abandoned camp, recovering coffee beans, tobacco, spices, embroidered saddles, and hundreds of sacks of captured goods. And from that loot came 2 of the most famous stories associated with Vienna in 1683. Both are worth clearing up, because both are wrong. The first story says the Viennese invented a crescent-shaped pastry to celebrate the defeat of the Ottoman crescent flag. That pastry, the story claims, became the croissant. The second says, Vienna's coffeehouse culture began with sacks of Ottoman coffee abandoned in Kara Mustafa's camp. In the most famous version, a Polish nobleman named Jerzy Kolczycki received the coffee after carrying coded messages through the Ottoman lines while disguised in Ottoman clothing. Both stories contain fragments of truth, but only fragments. The crescent-shaped kipferl had existed in Austria since at least the 13th century, roughly 400 years before the siege. The modern buttery croissant was a 19th century French development, inspired much later by Austrian baking. The 1683 origin story was a romantic invention added afterward. The coffee story is similar. Sacks of Ottoman coffee were captured. Kolczycki did exist, and he did receive an early license to sell coffee in Vienna. But coffee houses had already operated in Venice for decades. Armenian merchants had already been trading coffee into Vienna for years. Vienna's café culture was not created in a single triumphant moment after the siege. It emerged gradually over the 17th century. Kolczycki received the legend. Others had done much of the building. This is a small example of a much larger pattern in how the memory of Vienna was shaped. The siege was quickly compressed into one dramatic story about a civilization saving itself in a single afternoon. The reality was messier. And the messier reality is more interesting, because the actual consequences of September 12th were enormous. They simply took much longer to unfold than a story about pastries or coffee. For Kara Mustafa, the reckoning came quickly. He rode back to Belgrade and tried to reorganize what remained of his army. He blamed his subordinates for the collapse. Several were executed. Then he waited for the Sultan's judgment. It arrived on Christmas Day 1683, 3.5 months after the disaster outside Vienna. A silk cord was delivered to his tent in Belgrade. He was permitted to say his prayers. Then, on the direct order of Sultan Mehmed IV, he was strangled. His head was cut off and sent to Constantinople. The empire had punished its Grand Vizier for defeat. It could not punish away the strategic consequences, because the Battle of Vienna did not end a war. It began one. Within a year, a formal coalition known as the Holy League was created under papal sponsorship. It joined the Habsburg Emperor, the King of Poland, the Republic of Venice, and eventually the Russian Tsar, in a joint offensive against the Ottoman Empire. What followed became known as the Great Turkish War. It lasted 16 years. When peace was signed at Karlowitz in 1699, the Ottomans had lost most of Hungary, all of Transylvania, and their strategic position on the Middle Danube. The frontier that had run close to Vienna for more than a century was pushed hundreds of miles to the southeast. The high water mark of Ottoman power in Europe had been reached on July 14, 1683, when Kara Mustafa's headquarters tent rose within sight of Vienna. It would never rise that high again. Which brings us to the darker part of the story, and to a question the historian Norman Davies has raised more sharply than almost anyone. Poland had saved Vienna. Jan III Sobieski had ridden 400 miles and led the largest cavalry charge in European history to preserve a Habsburg emperor on his throne. What did Poland receive in return? In the short term, fame. Sobieski became one of the most celebrated monarchs in Europe. His portraits circulated through Catholic courts. The papacy declared him a hero of Christendom. In the medium term, very little. Freed from the immediate Ottoman threat, the Habsburgs consolidated their position in Central Europe. They did not repay the strategic favor in any lasting way. Sobieski's plan to turn his elected crown into a hereditary dynasty for his sons failed. He died in 1696. His sons were passed over. The Polish throne returned to the unstable bargaining of elective politics. In the long term, 1 century after the charge from the Kahlenberg, the price came due. Between 1772 and 1795, the Habsburg Empire joined Prussia and Russia in the 3 partitions of Poland. Peace, peace, the country that had ridden to save Vienna was divided and erased from the map of Europe. The state Sobieski had ruled ceased to exist. It would not return as a sovereign country until 1918. The Habsburg monarchy, which owed its survival in 1683 to Polish cavalry, became one of the powers that destroyed Poland. This is not a moral verdict. History does not hand out moral verdicts. It is the arithmetic of geopolitics. Yesterday's rescuer is not necessarily tomorrow's ally. A generation is a long time. A century is longer. And in that arithmetic, one final image is worth holding. Return to the opening scene. July 7, 1683. Emperor Leopold I sits in a carriage fleeing his own capital. 60,000 citizens crowd the road behind him. The suburbs of Vienna burn in the distance. A Habsburg dynasty is running from an army it does not believe it can stop. 67 days later, that same emperor returned. He rode into a liberated Vienna. His subjects welcomed him, and he was carefully, diplomatically introduced to Jan III Sobieski, the man whose army had made the return possible. By every account, the meeting was cold. Leopold was uncomfortable that a foreign king had entered his capital before him. Sobieski was uncomfortable that his contribution was already being quietly reduced in Habsburg accounts. Both men returned to their courts and began writing the story in their own way. But neither court could rewrite what had happened. For 60 days, a fortress had held. It had held because of an engineer named Georg Rimpler, who died in a tunnel no one ever mapped. It had held because of the stubbornness of Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg, who refused to negotiate when negotiation seemed like the only rational choice. It had held because of the patience of Charles of Lorraine, a French-born general fighting for a country in exile from a country he did not want to fight. And it had held long enough for a Polish king to complete one of the longest and most improbable relief marches in European history. Long enough to reach the edge of a forest that was supposed to be impassable. On the afternoon of September 12th, at full gallop on a slope east of the Kahlenberg, 3,000 men with wings on their backs decided in 90 minutes what 100,000 men had spent 60 days failing to decide. That is where the map of modern Europe began to be redrawn. Kara Mustafa believed he had one summer to write his name into history. He got his wish, just not in the way he intended.